Hi class, welcome to the supplementary video podcast from Monday's lecture on Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. As you recall at the end of class, you were given the second paper assignment, which is looking at the Fifth Symphony as a form of program music. You're to look at the five presentations of the short, 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 long motive across the symphony. Both in terms of terminology and the emotion that it conveys. You are then going to create your own short story that threads these emotions, and then you're going to think about how this reflects Beethoven's biography. And as I mentioned at the beginning of class on Monday, the most famous thing about Beethoven is, of course, that he became deaf. He's a deaf composer. And we're going to look at a document called the Heiligenstadt Testament, in which Beethoven addresses his deafness head on. And it's a document from 1802, which is 6 years before the composition of the Fifth Symphony. So we're going to use this as a way to understand Beethoven's biography up through the Heiligenstadt Testament and the composition of the Fifth Symphony. And then we're going to go through the Heiligenstadt Testament. As you saw, it's a fairly stream of consciousness, dense document. Don't emulate it in your own papers, please. And so I thought it would be useful to pull out 4 themes from it to help you understand the document a little better. So let's start with Beethoven's biography. And there's our dashing young Ludwig van Beethoven from 1803, the year after the Heiligenstadt Testament, where he's the age of 33. He's born in 1770 in this small city in West Germany called Bonn. And he develops prodigious talents as a pianist and as a composer. And he wants to pursue a career in music, and so he does what anyone does, which is go to the center of music making at that time, which is Vienna. It's not unlike someone who wants to make a career in country music going to Nashville. Vienna is where Mozart was from 1781 to 91. It's where Haydn resides. And put it this way, it's two of the people that we're still talking about 225 years later are there. So Beethoven wants to go there. And so he goes to Vienna, and he becomes a leading pianist and composer there. He develops a reputation as a virtuoso pianist. He gets concert engagements. He performs in salons, which are homes of aristocratic patrons. He takes composition lessons with Haydn briefly. He publishes some of his music. He gets to perform some of his pieces in public concerts, especially a couple of his early concertos. And concertos, if you remember, from Vivaldi and Mozart, are pieces with a soloist and an orchestra. They're fairly large works, and they're works where the composer themselves is usually the soloist. So these are quite lucrative engagements and sort of signals that he's kind of made it. So his career is on the rise as the 1790s go. But starting at some point in the late 1790s, somewhere around 1796 to 1798, we don't actually know because Beethoven doesn't admit it for a while, he starts to notice that his hearing is getting worse. And at first he brushes it off. Oh, maybe is something I ate. Maybe, I'm playing the piano too loudly. Who knows? Maybe it's a temporary thing. It'll just go away on its own. But it doesn't. And by about 1800, it starts to be noticeable and constant and debilitating. Now, there are 2 issues with this. First, obviously, a musician growing deaf is problematic. And actually, it's not so much because of composition. Composers are oftentimes able to sort of hear music in their mind and then kind of realize it. he can still compose while deaf. And he does. The most famous work that he writes while he's deaf is the Ninth Symphony with the famous Ode to Joy melody, dun dun da 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 da, etc. But the way that he actually made money at that time was as a pianist and as a piano teacher. He had a studio with a number of wealthy women and men who took lessons from him and paid well. And he had a number of concert engagements. How can you play the piano if you can't hear what you're doing? How can you play with an orchestra if you can't hear what they're doing? How can you teach a piano lesson if you can't hear what the students are doing? And he's also an up-and-coming composer. He's an up-and-coming, his career is on the rise. It's not secure at this point. He doesn't know that he's going to be talked about in classes 225 years later. He doesn't know that what's going to happen with his career. But he knows that as soon as he says that he's deaf or that he's getting hard of hearing, a lot of his opportunities are going to dry up. So this is incredibly problematic for him. The second thing is more broad. You would think, oh, his hearing is starting to go. You can just go get a hearing aid, right? During Beethoven's life, we can be blunt. No one really had any clue how the ear worked. They knew that sound went in the ears, but the mechanism that made us be able to, interpret that, interpret sound was totally unknown, and would basically be unknown until the late 19th century, over a half century after Beethoven's death. So during that time period, there were essentially two remedies. The first were these ear trumpets, which you stick in your ear, and theoretically it helps collect more sound waves and direct them to your ear. And they worked about as well as they look, which is to say, not particularly. They're perhaps better than nothing, but not much. There's a reason we use hearing aids now and not ear trumpets. The second possible cure is that you just go someplace quieter. And the idea here is that perhaps think of it like a broken bone. If you've ever had a broken bone, it gets put in a cast and you don't move it for a while, and over that time the bone heals until you can use it like new. The idea was similar in that if you just went someplace quieter where there was less oral stimuli, whatever was causing the deafness in your ear could heal itself. So the second solution, besides the ear trumpet one, was go to the country. Beethoven lived, of course, in Vienna, and this is a map of Vienna. And as you see, Vienna is actually a fairly condensed city that's surrounded by this ring. And so all the activity of Beethoven's life in Vienna is concentrated in a very small area. And it is a fairly loud, raucous city. And so perhaps if he left the city and went to the country just a few miles away, then that might make his hearing improve. And so he goes to this place called Heiligenstadt. And it's, at that time, a small town a few miles north of Vienna. Going left on this map is north, up the Danube River, which is this little line right there. It's now part of Vienna. It's the outskirts of the city, but at that time it was the country. And so in early 1802, he takes his doctor's advice and he goes there for most of 1802. And eventually, as his time there goes on, he realizes that it's not working, that his deafness, if anything, is getting worse. And so he starts to lose hope that there will ever be a cure. And there is no cure. He is totally deaf by about 1815, 1818. So he has to come to grips with the fact that his deafness is progressive and that at some point he's not going to be able to hear. And this throws him into a very deep depression where he doesn't know whether his life is worth living. And our sort of glimpse into his state of mind at this time period is this document which we've called the Heiligenstadt Testament, because it was written in Heiligenstadt on October 6th, 1802, and it is a testament, which is a legal document that indicates how one's possessions are to be divided up upon one's death. So, clearly the notion of death is on Beethoven's mind at this time period. And it is addressed to his two brothers, Karl and Johann. He has a very touchy relationship with Johann. In fact, Johann is never named in the document. He never writes Johann. He just gives a space where Johann should be. And it's there is a little bit of testament language in here. There is one sentence where he says, I declare you two to be the heirs of my small fortune, if so it can be called. Divide it fairly, bear with, and help one another. That's it. You see, there's a lot more to this document than just legalese. It's where he admits his affliction and admits his various emotions attached to it. And I should mention that this document was never actually given to his brothers. It was never published. It was never circulated. It was only discovered after Beethoven's death in 1827 among his personal effects. What I can say, though, is Beethoven, even though he lived in Vienna, he moved around a lot. He was not so great at paying rent. And he kept this among his personal effects for the 25 years between when he wrote it and when he died. So we can tell that this is actually a fairly meaningful document to him. It is also a messy document and one that is very stream of consciousness in its writing. So let's go through its organization to get a sense of how it's written. So it begins by sort of apologizing for how withdrawn he's been. Now, Beethoven was always quite introverted, quite prickly. He was never a party animal, shall we say. But the deafness had intensified this for reasons we'll get to in the next section. And, it caused him really to be withdrawn, and because he didn't want to admit it. He couldn't tell anyone he was deaf for the reasons I mentioned earlier, because it would mean the end of his career. And so he begins by saying, "O you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you. From childhood on, my heart and soul have been full of the tender feeling of goodwill, and I was even inclined to accomplish great things. But think that for 6 years now I've been hopelessly afflicted, made worse by senseless physicians, from year to year deceived with hopes of improvement, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady." So here we know that his deafness was secret. He did not tell anyone, even his siblings, about it, and that he had hope of curing, which in Heiligenstadt went away. He was no longer hopeful that his deafness would get better. If anything, he had to face the fact that it would, in fact, be worse. And so the next section is when he admits that he is deaf and admits that his deafness is incurable. And so he talks about, he gives this example of when he's in Heiligenstadt, some examples of when he's with people. Now, when he's with people, remember, he's at this point, fairly well-known musician. And what do you want to do with musicians? You want to talk music. You want to talk shop. And so you want to talk about, pieces of music. You want to talk about the sounds around you. And so he gives some examples of this in Heiligenstadt. And he says, quote, "But what a humiliation for me when someone standing next to me heard a flute in the distance and I heard nothing. Or someone standing next to me heard a shepherd singing, and again, I heard nothing." So he's forced to realize that even though he's supposed to be in this place where his hearing is supposed to be getting better, it's not. And there's nothing that he or anyone can do. So this throws him into a deep despair, whether or not he's with anyone or whether he's by himself. And it's not like you can shut your ears on and off. He's always aware of the state of his hearing. But then we get to this next part, which is one of the most powerful sections of this entire document, where he essentially says that he's thought about suicide, but his music is what held him back. He says immediately after the incident with the flute or shepherd singing, "Such incidents drove me almost to despair. A little more of that and I would have ended my life. It was only my art that held me back." And later on, "Recommend virtue to your children. It alone, not money, can make them happy. I speak from experience. This is what upheld me in time of misery. Thanks to it and to my art, I did not end my life by suicide." Now, some of you may have had depression, and we all listen to music, and music is what gives our lives. One of the things that gives our lives meaning. Our favorite songs, our favorite artists. There's something ineffable and powerful about it that gives our lives a sense of meaning. And here is one of the most grand statements of that, where Beethoven says his music is what keeps him alive. And that's a really powerful statement. But it's not the end of the document. And we get a sense, actually, that this statement is much more fragile than Beethoven sort of lets on. Because the ending is actually quite ambiguous. He says, quote, "With joy I hasten towards death. If it comes before I have had the chance to develop all my artistic capacities, it will still be coming too soon despite my harsh fate, and I should probably wish it later. Yet even so I should be happy, for would it not free me from a state of endless suffering?" This is the end of the document. This comes after the statement, art could be salvation. And this is where he sort of lets on that perhaps art may not be as powerful as he wants. And perhaps, despite his present strength, that may not always be so much there. And so he may die early, maybe something related to the deafness, and maybe due to his own hand. And the fact that this is a testament indicates his knowledge that this could be a possibility. And although I didn't assign it, there is a postscript 4 days later which is much more desperate. So it's a very ambiguous ending, and not one where there's a chance for a happy ending, but one where he knows that might not happen. So some things to think about. The document is written in 1802. He composes the Fifth Symphony in 1808, and he lives till 1827. He dies at the age of 57 from illness. And 57 is actually old age in Vienna during that time period. Vienna in the early Industrial Revolution does not, life expectancy is in the 40s. So he makes it to 57. That's very good. So he embarks in the next decade on one of the most transformative musical periods of musical composition in music history, not only for his own composition, but for the number of musicians who were influenced by his compositions of the following decade, the Fifth Symphony being one of them. And it's so influential that we speak of this period as sort of the pivot point between the classical period, which we talked about in the previous unit, and the Romantic period, which we're going to talk about in the next class unit. So he obviously chooses composition. And so you might think about two questions here. The first, how might the first three movements of the Fifth Symphony reflect the myriad emotions of the Testament? How might the different emotions conveyed by the different presentations of the motive reflect things that are in the testament. Then the second thing, how might the transition between the third and fourth movements reflect Beethoven's assumed decision to pursue his art in the face of deafness? That is, how might the end of the transition from the end of the third movement to the beginning of the fourth movement thus reflect the ending, the transition from the mood in the Heiligenstadt Testament to his assumed decision to pursue his composition with knowledge that he is ultimately going deaf. So I hope this helped you understand a little bit of Beethoven's biography. If you have questions about the Heiligenstadt Testament or about the paper assignment, come see me during office hours, talk to me after class, shoot me an email, and I'll see you in class on Wednesday. Thanks.